Hello, ladies and gents. I'm live on YouTube. I just want to say, I want to influence you today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, OAPs. You want to better your life circumstances. As you're getting older, your body gets deteriorated. You want to do something a bit more simple than manual work. Anyway, when you read, you may want to get into university, but yeah, get into university or adult learning. When you read, record your reading so you can listen to your reading back, go back over your notes. Always reference your reading. I'm on the module DD211, Understanding Politics, Ideas and Institutions in the Modern World. The book is edited by Richard Heffernan, Simon Usherwood and Edward Westmisnter. The book is published at the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes, MK76AA, first published in 2015, second edition 2022. Thank you for the follow. On page 39, introduction. The UK Prime Minister and US President, operating in very different political systems, face very different leadership opportunities and constraints. This owes much to the fact that the Prime Minister, being indirectly elected, usually emerges from the parties commanding a majority within the UK Parliament, whereas, by contrast, the President, being directly elected by the people, is separated from the US Congress. This chapter explores the following 5 institutional differences between the Prime Minister and the President. The US President is directly elected. The UK Prime Minister is indirectly elected. The US President is separate from the autonomous of the US legislator, but the UK Prime Minister is drawn from and accountable to the UK legislator. The US President is not the leader of his party, but the UK Prime Minister is. The US President is the head of a personalised executive, but the UK Prime Minister is the head of a collegial executive. The US President operates within a federal state with a limited government, but the UK Prime Minister operates within a unitary state with an unlimited government. The 5 differences reflect the fact that the UK Prime Minister is parliamentary chief executive, while the US President is a presidential one. Thus, the respective political system of the UK and US clearly determine and shape the ways of which 2 heads of government operate. Each one is the chief executive of their respective country. They are leading politician and chief diplomat, but they are very different types of chief executive. To put it simply, the UK has a parliamentary system, so it has a parliamentary chief executive. The US has a presidential system, so it has a presidential chief executive. To understand these different types of chief executive, we need to explore the political systems from which they emerge. Page 40. The institutional differences between UK Prime Ministers and US Presidents, Chapter 14. 2 presidents and prime ministers are elected differently. The US President is directly elected, but the UK Prime Minister is indirectly elected. The US Constitution requires the President to be over the age of 35. To be a US citizen and to be born within the territory of the US, UK Constitution imposes no such similar obligations on the UK Prime Minister, but it is now a well-established constitutional convention that he or she must be an elected member of the House of Commons. It used to be the case of that the Prime Minister could sit in either the Commons or the House of Lords in regard to the moment and mode of election. Then Prime Ministers and Presidents differ considerably, each subject to different arrangements that differently empower and constrain them. Put at its simplest, the US President is directly elected, while the UK Prime Minister is indirectly elected. The US citizens elect the person who is to serve as the President. The President's name, alongside his or her vice presidential running mate, is on the ballot, and citizens choose them by their vote. Under the US Constitution, the Electoral College of 50 states, in which each state has a proportionate vote in line with its population size, elects the President when one candidate wins the majority of that college, which not be a majority of the popular vote across the US. By contrast, the UK Prime Minister is never specifically elected as Prime Minister, but elected only as an MP in one of 650 constituencies. No UK citizen, therefore, makes a direct choice as to who should be Prime Minister, even if some citizens cast a vote for a party in a hope of the leader of the party they vote for will emerge as Prime Minister. Once the election has been conducted, Prime Ministers become Prime Minister because their party makes them party leader and because their party has a parliamentary majority by itself or part of a coalition. The US Constitution prescribes that the US President is elected on a prescribed date, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, or the first Tuesday after the 1st November, and takes office at 12 p.m. EST. On January the 20th of January of the year following their election, presidents are able under the Constitution to seek re-election only once. Most usually find themselves a lame duck, late there in the second terms, as attention turns to the race determining their successor. No similar restrictions apply in the UK. Prime Ministers can serve for so long as their country grants their party a common majority at an election. Or they can form a coalition government with another party, should their party be the largest party but lack a Commons majority. Or lead a minority government should the Commons majority not combine against them, and that Commons majority permits them to lead their party. There is no formal prime ministerial term limit, and prime ministers can try to remain in office for as long as country permits them, or their parties allow them. Prime ministers and presidents differ not only in their appointment to the office, but also their removal. Post-war UK prime ministers have left office in one of three ways: by resigning the party leadership and thereby the premiership. Winston Churchill in 1955, Anthony Eden in 1957, Harold Macmillan in 1963, Harold Wilson in 1976, Tony Blair in 1997, David Cameron in 2016, and Theresa May in 2019. By being essentially removed from the premiership by being successfully changed by the party leader Margaret Thatcher in 1990, by resigning as Prime Minister following their party's loss of the Commons majority at an election. Clement Attlee in 1951, Alec Douglas Home in 1964, Wilson in 1970, Edward Heath in 1974, James Callaghan in 1979, John Major in 1997, and Gordon Brown in 2010. While 7 of these post-war prime ministers left office following defeat at a general election, 7 others resigned when their party still had a partisan or working majority. 3 prime ministers left office, not of their own free will. Thatcher was essentially sacked by our own parliamentary party after being successfully changed as party leader. Blair felt obliged to resign at a moment of the choosing rather than risk being changed by Brown, his Chancellor. Cameron went, having lost the European Union EU referendum, and May left, having then failed to deliver Brexit. The same could perhaps be said for Churchill, Eden, and Macmillan. Only Wilson went without any pressure being applied to him and when no one accepted him to step aside. Prime ministers, even if there is no formal restriction on their term of office, have to retain their office by both having their party re-elected at a general election and retaining the loyalty of their Commons majority. Prime ministers can often ensure they have the support of a large majority, page 42, of their party's MPs by delivering electoral, political and career goods. Those individual MPs desire and the party requires a significant tenure in office. It's thus more likely than not, so prime ministers sit more firmly in office than is sometimes thought, particularly when compared with US presidents. Thatcher lasted 11.5 years and Blair 10, both longer terms of office than is possible for the modern US president, who cannot serve any more than 2 or 4 terms. Of course, even if the Prime Minister is unseated by their party in the Commons, the partisanship of their party ensures that Labour majority in the Commons will place him or her with the Labour Prime Minister. For instance, Callaghan replaced Wilson, Brown replaced Blair, and a Conservative majority will retain a Conservative Prime Minister. Major replaced Thatcher, May replaced Cameron, and Boris Johnson replaced May. In the US, however, presidents enjoy an inviolable security of tenure denied to Prime Minister. Post-war presidents have left the office in these 5 ways. Having served the one term they were elected to: Harry Truman in 1953, Lyndon B. Johnson having served out of John F. Kennedy's first term in 1969, Jim Carter in 1991, George Washington Bush in 1993, and Donald Trump in 2021. Having served 2 terms, Dwight Eisenhower in 1961, Ronald Reagan in 1989, Bill Clinton in 2001, George Washington Bush in 2009, Barack Obama in 2017. Having been assassinated in the midst of their first term, Kennedy in 1963. Having been forced to resign in the midst of their second term, Richard Nixon in 1974. Having failed to be elected in their own right following the expiration of their predecessor first term, to which they had been appointed as Vice President, Gerald Ford in 1977. JF Kennedy was found to be fascist, supporting Adolf Hitler in his anti-Semitism ways, his jibing. Anyway, page 43. The Congress cannot remove a president for political reasons. Presidents cannot be sacked, although they can be impeached should they be deemed to have committed a high crime or a misdemeanor, short of something like Kennedy's assassination or Nixon's resignation. Presidents serve out the term to which they are elected. Only if the president is thought to have broken the law can Congress remove him or her. Even then, a legislative supermajority is required for impeachment. On being charged by a vote 50% plus 1 in the House of Representatives, the president can only be impeached by a vote of 66% plus 1 in the Senate. Impeachment by a vote of 66% plus 1 in the Senate. Impeachment has now been attempted 4 times, most recently in the case of Clinton during 1988 to 89, and Trump in 2020, and having left the office again in 2021. Impeachment has never been successfully impleted, although in 1974, Richard Nixon did resign before he would have been removed from office. Having been charged by the House of Representatives, both Clinton and Trump were found not guilty by the Senate. Prime ministers clearly lack the personal mandate conferred upon the president by virtue of his or her being personally elected of the office they occupy. How you doing? But Congress can claim its own mandate because it too represents the people. The president is confined by the Constitution to serve only 2 terms and seek re-election only once. He or she can thus be weakened in office during the last 2 years of a second term. Page 44. Chapter 14, Institution Differences between the UK Prime Ministers and US Presidents. If elected to one, then they can be considered a lame duck and be unable to pass any significant legislation because the political class are awaiting the election of their successor. Prime Ministers, because they face no normal restriction in the time they can spend in office, can be more authoritative in office for longer. Should the President ease to be President in his or her term of office, then he or she, by constitutional law, can only be replaced by a Vice President, who is the next in line of presidential succession. By contrast, the Prime Minister, if vacating the premiership in between the election, will be replaced by whichever MP is chosen by the party to become party leader in his or her stead. Hence, when Cameron and May resigned, the Conservatives, making use of their party rules, chose May and Johnson respectively as their replacements. Prime ministers, in theory, if not always in practice, can be cast aside by their party because if removed as party leader, they cannot remain prime minister. Presidents cannot be removed by their party only by a supermajority of the Senate when convicted of committing a high crime or a misdemeanor, not for political error or failure. Page 45. Presidents and prime ministers have different relations with their legislators. The US President is separate from the autonominess of the Congress, but the UK Prime Minister is drawn from and unaccountable to the UK Parliament. In the UK, electors elect the legislator from which the Prime Minister-led executive emerges. The Prime Minister can be Prime Minister by commanding a majority of the House of Commons. Parliamentary systems require a non-separation of powers between the executive and legislator. The indirectly elected Prime Minister usually heads a single-party government, which, having a Commons majority, can usually very effectively lead to the legislator. Of course, as in the special case of David Cameron between 2010 and 2015, Prime Ministers can lead to a coalition government when there is a hung parliament for an election in which no party has a majority and a single-party government cannot therefore be formed. May and initially, Johnson lacked a Commons majority in their own right between 2017 and 2014, when their Conservative government had to rely on an agreement with a smaller party, the Democratic Unionist Party, in order to possess a Commons majority. Be it a single party or a more unusual coalition government, UK executive that the Prime Minister has considerable inter-legislative powers. The House of Commons provides the government, enacts its legislation and supports its constitution in office, but it also has to oversee its work, scrutinise its activity and hold it to account. Such contradictory functions, the very product of non-separation of powers between government and parliament, sharply conflict. As a result, the Commons majority invariably prioritised providing and supporting the government over its responsibility to check and balance it. In supporting the government in office, the Commons cannot easily check and balance the government's activities because the party majority invariably agrees with the government is doing. Legislative losses are therefore extremely rare. Both May and again initially Johnson found themselves in a very unusual circumstances of lacking a Commons majority to achieve Brexit in 2018-19. A cross-party majority, including Brexit Tory rebels, was formed 3 times to reject May's withdrawal agreement. So weak was May, she could not prevent a cross-party majority of Remainers opposed to leaving the EU, seize control of the legislative agenda to prevent Britain leaving without a deal. Page 46. May's fall, Johnson, on becoming Prime Minister, had to force a general election to obtain Commons majority he wanted to get Brexit done. But the problems of Brexit in the 2017 Parliament aside, the UK executive is reliably able to rely upon its Commons majority to enact its policy. In UK, all governments have occasionally to make compromises, mostly of marginal nature, but sometimes major. Keeping one's parliamentary troops reasonably happy is all part of the governing game. The major government in 1992 to 97 boasting a small, unreliable majority, withdrawal plan to privatise the post office in light of strenuous objections from many of its backbenchers. Party whips imposed a party line, which is determined by the parliamentary leadership. But they clearly also report the privately expressed views of backbenchers upward to that leadership, making them aware of the parliamentary opinion and the impacts government proposals are likely to have. The Blair and the Brown governments of 1997-2010 had large common majorities, but occasionally amended legislation in the light of backbench criticism and pressure. In February 2003, 139 Labour MPs voted against the invention in Iraq, but Blair easily won, this thanks to the support of Conservative MPs. Cameron's coalition was sometimes obliged to change the course because of similar criticism and pressure. And May was constantly buffeted by the absence of a settled majority for Brexit during their ill-fated premiership. In the UK, the Prime Minister is guaranteed a legislative majority. In the US, has no such guarantee. The UK Prime Minister can only be Prime Minister if he or she has a partisan Commons majority, but the separately elected President withhold their office even if the opposing party holds power in Congress. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, faced a Republican-controlled Congress for 6 or 8 years he spent with the White House. Democrat Barack Obama has had to work with the Republican House for much of his presidency. Richard Nixon, a Republican, had to work with the entire Democratic-controlled Congress, and did his successor, Gerald Ford, and Donald Trump enjoyed little, if any, support in Congress, even with Republican House and Senate, especially not when the Democrats took over both in 2019, as Congress is elected separately from the president, and some members are re-elected in the midterm of election 2 years after each presidential election. It is significantly, often very sharply independent of presidents in the way the UK Parliament is not at all independent of the Prime Minister-led UK executive. Page 47, got three more pages to go. In addition, even should the president's party have a congressional majority, the president can find that Congress will not work with them. Clinton's biggest defeat in Congress on health care reform came when the Democrats held the House and the Senate. The same true for Trump. A president often cannot rely on the backing of their own party's House and Senate. Although Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton for 2 years had Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate, only Johnson was able to pass his legislative program largely unscathed. And then only in 1965 and 1966, when the Democrats had 2-to-1 majority in both the House and Senate. And when the legacy of John F. Kennedy could be used to argue for civil rights, the president has the right to veto legislation presented by him by Congress. But Congress can override a presidential veto by a vote of 2/3 of its members. Such power is rarely used. The president thus has the right to approve legislation, but he or she cannot force Congress to do what it does not want to do. To influence the making of laws, the president has to bargain and negotiate with the Independent and Autonomous Congress. All federal programs and spending proposals require the support of Congress, and senior governmental appointees, judicial nominees, and international treaties need Senate approval. The president is therefore engaged in a constant process of persuasion. Some, like Trump, can face congressional majorities which refuse to support them. This can occur when the opposition party is eager to find any reason to remove the president from office. The institutional separation of powers between the executive and the legislature best explains the US president's lack of legislative purchase. Although elected at the same time as every member of the House of Representatives and a third of the Senate, the US president is elected in different election race, separate from the representatives and the senators, all of whom were elected of different representative units and who are therefore accountable to very different constituencies, although congressional races have been nationalised and never before elections are still disadjudicated. Legislators and would-be legislators prioritise their own issues, respond to their own electors, and always have to bear in mind what is happening in their district or state. As a result, enacting the wishes of a president to whom they are not likely to be politically beholden is rarely a priority and is never a requirement for advancement with Congress, other than informal appeals for partisanship. The president has a few carrots and sticks available to gain congressional support of their legislative wishes. Hi, Rich. In the UK, however, where the political fates of the executive and its parliamentary majority is intertwined, the very opposite is true, because partisanship and executive patronage are there the glue further blinding the executive and the legislature together. The Prime Minister has many carrots and sticks to wield. Supporting the party line is the primary means by which a backbench MP works. His or her ticket to the party front bench. The party leader, the Prime Minister, is the principal gatekeeper determining entry into the government, working with party whips and officials who talent spot on his or her behalf. In the case of the opposition, it is the party leader who decides which MPs are in the shadow government. This provides a Prime Minister and opposition party leader with considerable but never overwhelming troop-gathering powers. In addition to deciding who is on the front bench, the party leader also decides what posts they should hold. Patronage is never unfettered, and often the Prime Minister is obliged to place would-be foes and to advance able persons, not simply reward loyalists and friends. In addition, discarded former ministers and those who never were appointed ministers can oppose the Prime Minister and his or her policy, which can undermine any party leader, particularly one who is underperforming. As such, Prime Ministers, by virtue of a supported Commons majority, usually enjoy the opportunity to lead the legislature, cannot assume they can ever command it. Page 49, last page. Short of national emergencies such as the Great Depression following the Wall Street crash of 1929, the Japanese invasion of Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the events following the 11th of September 2001, not similar opportunities for legislative management present themselves to the US President, while accountable to and removable by the legislator. The Prime Minister is usually defended by his or her Commons majority. Parliamentary parties have removed their particular Prime Minister whilst retaining their party in government and discussed earlier. But provided the Prime Minister commands the support of his or her party, usually being popular and successful, he or she remains the de facto leader of the legislature alongside the Prime. These two de facto legislature alongside other ministers. The President has no privileges. Indeed, translated into US terms, the Prime Minister could be described as possessing the functions of two most powerful US legislative officials, the Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Senate Majority Leader. These two posts are combined into one of UK's legislative, in which the Commons also has more clout than the unelected Lords. Patronage may not save the underperforming Prime Minister, who is unable to deliver the electoral spoils and policy successes his or her parliamentary party craves, but it confers the ability to win legislative friends and influence legislative people. It also helps focus the minds of their other members of the executive, all of whom, in some form, find that further preferment within government can often be more easily secured by being on side with the Prime Minister. Remember too, for reasons explored below, that the parties in Parliament usually follow their leaders because they are in agreement with them. Having served as an equivalent of the Electoral College, returning to government, UK MPs often feel obligated to their party's leadership, but US representatives and senators are not similarly obligated in their presidential system. US presidents can rarely lead Congress. In domestic policy terms, a US president is often unable to persuade Congress of its merits of his or her case. So they can find they're unable to secure their political objectives and are enjoying office without legislative power. Page 50. We can nip that in the bud there. Thank you very much, you listeners, and being patient. Appreciate it.